a couple of weeks ago, and I happened to see it, and I was amazed because I heard somebody say, here's a black belt karate expert, and I figured at least somebody's going to be 15 or 16 years old, right? Because I know it takes quite a number of years to reach that degree of proficiency.
The Tonight Show was many things: a launching pad for careers, a victory lap for legends, and a place where America ended its day with a laugh. Johnny Carson ran that couch with effortless charm, turning awkward pauses into punchlines and nervous guests into household names. But every now and then, someone walked out who even Carson couldn't fully rein in. Whether it was bizarre behavior, uncomfortable tension, or moments that went completely off the rails. Here are the 7 most awkward guests Johnny Carson ever had. 1. Shelley Winters.
Well,
How would you define that? And then I'll
English
ask.
are rather kinky. They never talk about sex. Never.
We just do it, madam.
Yes, don't.
It was supposed to be a standard night on The Tonight Show, the kind Johnny Carson had mastered better than anyone else. 2 famous guests on the couch, a relaxed conversation, a few laughs, and everyone goes home happy. On Johnny's right sat Shelley Winters, the Oscar-winning actress known not just for her talent, but for her blunt honesty and refusal to be talked down to. On the other side was Oliver Reed, the notoriously hard-living British actor, whose reputation for drinking and macho bravado often arrived before he did. At first, everything followed the usual late-night rhythm. The audience laughed, Johnny guided the discussion, and both guests played along. But as the conversation went on, Reed began to dominate the floor. What started as casual banter slowly drifted into something far less comfortable. He launched into a string of remarks about women, how they should behave, where they belonged, and what he seemed to think their role was in relation to men. Even by the standards of the time, the comments landed poorly. You could feel the shift in the room. Laughter faded into uneasy chuckles. Johnny tried several times to redirect the conversation, tossing in jokes and changing topics, but Reed kept circling back, digging himself deeper with each comment. The longer he talked, the more uncomfortable the moment became. Shelley Winters, meanwhile, wasn't hiding her reaction. She sat stiffly, her expression tightening with every sentence. Winters had fought hard for her place in Hollywood, surviving an industry that rarely treated women kindly. Sitting silently while someone casually dismissed women on national television clearly wasn't an option for her. The tension on the couch was impossible to miss. Then, without warning, the situation exploded. Shelley stood up, reached for her drink, and dumped it directly over Oliver Reed's head. The studio froze. The audience gasped. Johnny Carson's eyes widened as liquid and ice ran down Reed's face. Reed himself looked completely stunned, as if it took a moment for reality to catch up with what had just happened. There was no punchline, no setup, and no wink to the camera. This wasn't a planned gag or a comedy bit gone right. It was a spontaneous act of frustration playing out live on television. Johnny, ever the professional, quickly moved to cut to a commercial, but the damage or the magic was already done. The thing is, this moment became legendary. It showed that The Tonight Show wasn't always the safe, sanitized entertainment people expected. Sometimes real emotions broke through, and when they did, it was absolutely electric television. Awkward? Absolutely. Unforgettable? You bet. 2. Charles Grodin.
I don't know what to do when I'm out here because most of the reasons people come on a talk show, I can't really do that.
Charles Grodin was a gifted comedian and actor, but when he walked onto The Tonight Show, he wasn't there to play the usual late-night game. Most guests treated Johnny Carson's couch like a friendly pit stop, smile, promote a movie, tell a charming story, and let Johnny guide the mood. Grodin did the exact opposite. His appearances weren't interviews so much as carefully constructed acts of disruption, designed to make everyone in the room slightly uneasy. Grodin developed a deadpan, deliberately confrontational style that felt completely out of place on late-night television. He didn't laugh at Johnny's jokes. He didn't offer easy punchlines. Instead, he challenged questions, took mild comments personally, and acted as though he'd been deeply wronged by the show itself. The brilliance was in how seriously he played it. There were no winks, no obvious signals to the audience that this was a bit. He sat there with a calm, wounded expression, delivering every line as if he truly meant it. Johnny Carson, who thrived on control and timing, suddenly found himself on unfamiliar ground. He was the master of steering conversations, rescuing bad guests, and turning tension into laughs. Grodin refused to be rescued. He interrupted Johnny, criticized the show's staff, and spoke as if he was reluctantly enduring the entire experience. For perhaps the first time, Johnny didn't fully have the upper hand. The result was a series of long, uncomfortable pauses that felt almost dangerous for live television. Johnny would hesitate, clearly weighing his next move. The audience sat in limbo, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. Even when Johnny tried to soften things with humor, Grodin stayed locked in, never breaking character, never letting the tension dissolve. One of Grodin's most famous appearances centered on a supposed grievance about poor promotion from the show. He calmly listed ways The Tonight Show had failed him in the past, sounding genuinely hurt and offended. Johnny attempted to smooth things over with jokes and reassurances, but Grodin pushed back every time, politely yet persistently. The more Johnny tried to move on, the more Grodin insisted on staying right there in the discomfort. The genius of it was that it was comedy, just a very different kind than people were used to. Grodin was playing a character, this difficult, sensitive guest who couldn't be placated. But he played it so convincingly that it created real tension, real awkwardness. Johnny would often look into the camera with this expression that said, "Are you seeing this?" And we were. We definitely were. 3. Joan Rivers.
Yeah, well, movies get me crazy like that. And I was very affected by Kramer versus Kramer, because I wasn't wanted as a child.
Oh, now
And-
here we go.
oh,
Yeah, how do you know
John.
you weren't wanted as a child?
I was not wanted.
Not all awkward moments on The Tonight Show happened under the bright studio lights. Some of the most uncomfortable situations unfolded quietly behind the scenes, only to resurface later in ways that made everyone uneasy. The fallout between Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers is a perfect example of that kind of slow-burning awkwardness, the kind that lingers for years and never really gets resolved. Joan Rivers wasn't just another guest on Johnny's couch. She was one of his most frequent visitors, and for a long time, his clear favorite. Johnny trusted her enough to make her his regular substitute host, a role he didn't hand out lightly. When Johnny took nights off, Joan stepped in, and she was excellent at it. She was sharp, fearless, and fast on her feet. Audiences loved her, critics praised her, and many people quietly assumed she was being groomed as a possible successor. Their relationship looked solid, built on mutual respect and years of shared history. To Joan, though, being the permanent second option wasn't enough. When Fox approached her with an offer for her own late-night talk show, it felt like the chance of a lifetime. This wasn't just another hosting gig. It was her show, her name, her spotlight. There was only one catch. The program would air directly opposite The Tonight Show, putting her in head-to-head competition with Johnny himself. That's where everything fell apart. By most accounts, Joan didn't sit Johnny down and tell him about the deal before it became public. Instead, Johnny found out through industry chatter. For a man who valued loyalty above almost everything else, this felt like a deep personal wound. In his eyes, Joan wasn't just moving on. She was challenging him and doing it without warning. Johnny's reaction was cold and final. Joan Rivers was banned from The Tonight Show. No farewell appearance, no quiet reconciliation. Just gone. For the remainder of Johnny's run, one of his most important collaborators was never invited back. The two stopped speaking entirely, and what had once been a warm professional bond turned into a long, bitter silence. Years later, the discomfort still hadn't faded. Joan attended Johnny's funeral, despite the fact that they had never made peace. And in typical Joan Rivers fashion, she later spoke openly about her feelings, even calling Johnny a son of a bitch. It wasn't meant as a joke. It was the sound of someone still carrying hurt, anger, and disappointment decades later. This wasn't awkward in the laugh-it-off late-night sense. It was awkward in a deeply human way, a story about ambition, pride, and a friendship that cracked under pressure. Everyone in Hollywood knew about the feud, and it hovered over both of their legacies. It was proof that sometimes the most uncomfortable moments in show business aren't the ones you watch. They're the ones that never get fixed. 4. Bob Hope.
Hays, Kansas is where the University of Kansas has a branch. It's like Santa Barbara here.
Bob Hope was an undeniable legend. By the time he sat across from Johnny Carson, he had already lived several entertainment lifetimes. He entertained troops through multiple wars, starred in dozens of hit movies, hosted countless specials, and became one of the most recognizable comedians on the planet. His reputation was rock solid. But as The Tonight Show proved more than once, legendary status didn't automatically translate into being a great talk show guest. The issue wasn't that Bob Hope wasn't funny. He absolutely was. The problem was that Hope didn't really converse. He performed. When Bob Hope came on The Tonight Show, he arrived loaded with jokes, one-liners, and carefully polished stories he'd told many times before. Instead of easing into a relaxed back and forth, he treated the couch like a stage, and the interview like a mini stand-up set. Johnny's role, whether he liked it or not, was to sit there and react. Johnny Carson thrived on spontaneity. He loved unexpected turns, off-the-cuff remarks, and moments that felt like they were happening for the first time. Bob Hope's style came from a much older school of comedy, where preparation ruled and everything was locked in ahead of time. There was no wiggle room. Every answer led straight into another joke, regardless of what Johnny asked. You could see the frustration creep in. Johnny would attempt to ask a genuine question, hoping to spark a real conversation or pull out an unscripted story. Hope would listen politely, then smoothly pivot into another pre-planned punchline. It felt less like an interview and more like Johnny accidentally wandered into someone else's act. The timing was tight, the jokes were familiar, and the human connection was missing. That disconnect created the awkwardness. Audiences tuned in expecting Magic 2 comedy giants trading stories, teasing each other, and creating something special together. Instead, what they got was Johnny working overtime to loosen things up while Bob Hope powered through his material, almost on autopilot. The energy just didn't match. At one point, Johnny even joked darkly about it, saying that if he ever reached the stage where he was only doing rehearsed bits like Bob Hope, someone should just shoot him. It was a sharp comment, especially considering Hope's legendary status, but it revealed how deeply those stiff interviews bothered Johnny. The sad irony is that Bob Hope likely never meant to make things uncomfortable. He was simply doing what had worked for decades. But The Tonight Show had evolved into something different, a place where looseness mattered more than polish. And in that setting, Hope's old-school perfection created a strange tension, turning one of comedy's greatest icons into one of Johnny Carson's most awkward guests. 5. Andy Kaufman.
George Washington, he was the first president.
That's good. They'll ask you that.
Abraham Lincoln, he was the...
Andy Kaufman was never interested in being liked. He was interested in pushing boundaries, making people uncomfortable, and blurring the line between comedy and something else entirely, something weirder, something that didn't have a name. When Kaufman appeared on The Tonight Show, you never knew what you were going to get. Sometimes he'd show up as himself, or at least some version of himself. Other times, he'd come as his alter ego, the foreign man, speaking in broken English and doing intentionally terrible impressions. And sometimes he'd do something so bizarre that nobody, including Johnny, had any idea how to respond. One of Kaufman's most famous bits was just reading The Great Gatsby out loud to the audience. Not a funny excerpt, not a parody, just reading the book, page after page, in a monotone voice, until people started walking out. That's the kind of performer he was. He wanted to see how far he could push the audience before they broke. Johnny Carson was a master at handling unusual guests, but Kaufman was on another level. The awkwardness came from the fact that Kaufman's performances often weren't funny in any traditional sense. They were challenging, they were weird, they were sometimes boring on purpose, and Johnny had to sit there and figure out how to react. You would see Johnny laughing sometimes, but it was this uncertain laugh, like he wasn't sure if he was in on the joke or if the joke was on him. The audience would sit in confused silence, not knowing if they should applaud or not. The whole energy of the show would shift into this strange, uncomfortable space where the normal rules didn't apply. Kaufman also had this way of never breaking character, never winking at the camera to let you know it was all an act. He committed fully to whatever weird thing he was doing, which made it even more uncomfortable for everyone else. Johnny would try to interview him, but Kaufman would stay in character, giving these bizarre answers that didn't quite make sense. The thing about Kaufman's awkwardness is that it was intentional. He wanted people to feel uncomfortable. He believed that discomfort was a valid form of entertainment, maybe even more interesting than traditional comedy. And while that made for some truly memorable television moments, it also made for some segments where everyone was just counting the minutes until they could go to commercial 6. Tiny Tim.
In cabarets and nightclubs, in poor homes, and also for the needy as well as the up-to-date.
For the needy?
Tiny Tim was one of the strangest celebrities to ever grace American television. With his long, stringy hair, his pale complexion, and his high-pitched, warbling voice singing songs from the 1920s, he was like something from another dimension. And Johnny Carson, to his credit, seemed genuinely fascinated by him. But fascination doesn't mean things weren't awkward. Oh boy, were they awkward. Tiny Tim became a regular on The Tonight Show, and every appearance was a journey into weirdness. He'd sing his signature song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips, in that distinctive falsetto voice, strumming his ukulele and looking like a Victorian ghost who'd gotten lost on the way to the afterlife. Johnny would try to interview him, and Tiny Tim would respond in this overly formal, old-fashioned way, calling everyone Mr. Carson and Miss Whoever, speaking like he was from a completely different era. Which, in a way, he was, at least in his mind. The peak of Tiny Tim awkwardness came when he got married on The Tonight Show. Yes, an actual wedding broadcast to millions of people. His bride was a 17-year-old named Miss Vicky, and the whole thing was this surreal spectacle that nobody quite knew how to process. Johnny hosted the wedding, trying to add some normalcy to the proceedings, but there was no making this normal. Tiny Tim was intensely earnest about the whole thing, treating it with this old-fashioned reverence that clashed with the absurdity of getting married on a talk show. The audience didn't know whether to be touched or horrified. Throughout all of Tiny Tim's appearances, you could see Johnny struggling with how to react. On one hand, Tiny Tim was clearly sincere. He wasn't trying to be weird or funny. This was just who he was. On the other hand, his presence was so unusual, so far outside the realm of normal celebrity behavior, that it created this constant undercurrent of awkwardness. Johnny would sometimes glance at the camera with this look that said, "I know this is strange, but let's just go with it." And the audience did go with it, because Tiny Tim was weirdly compelling. You couldn't look away, but you also couldn't quite believe what you were watching. 7. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert.
He had a director who I think gave him a certain amount of discipline, and there is a tendency, I think, when comedians who have
I'm not doing anything.
Are you doing what you did on Saturday Night Live?
Imagine this. You're an actor. You've just made a movie. You're invited on The Tonight Show to promote it. Everything seems great. Then Johnny brings out 2 film critics, and they proceed to absolutely destroy your movie while you sit there, live on national television, forced to smile and take it. That's exactly what happened when Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert appeared on The Tonight Show alongside Chevy Chase. The 2 famous critics were there to do their thing, talk about movies, give their opinions, the usual. But somewhere along the way, they started discussing a film that Chevy Chase had just starred in, and they hated it. Not just mild disappointment, not it had some good moments, but no, they really genuinely disliked the movie and said so, in detail, while Chevy sat right there on the same couch. The awkwardness was immediate and thick enough to cut with a knife. Chevy tried to laugh it off, to be a good sport about it, but you could see the hurt in his eyes. This was his work they were trashing, his performance they were criticizing, and he had to sit there and take it with millions of people watching. There was nowhere to hide, no way to escape. Johnny, to his credit, tried to smooth things over, but what could he do? Siskel and Ebert weren't being mean for the sake of being mean. They were just doing their job, being honest about a movie they didn't like. But the collision of professional criticism and personal feelings, all happening live on TV, created one of the most uncomfortable moments in talk show history. You could see Chevy's face going through different emotions, trying to be funny about it, getting defensive, trying to argue back, eventually just sitting there in the stunned silence while these 2 guys picked apart his movie scene by scene. The audience didn't know how to react either. Some people laughed nervously. Others just sat in silence. It was one of those moments where everyone watching felt embarrassed for everyone involved. That's the worst kind of awkwardness, the kind where nobody did anything really wrong, but somehow everything went horribly, uncomfortably wrong anyway. Johnny kept trying to change the subject, to move on to something else, but the damage was done. The rest of the segment was stilted and uncomfortable, with Chevy clearly just wanting to get off that couch and go home. The beauty of it all is that Johnny kept inviting interesting, unpredictable people onto his show. He didn't play it safe after Shelley dumped that drink or after Grodin made him uncomfortable. He kept pushing, kept experimenting, kept making television that could surprise you. That's not just awkward, that's unforgettable.